Hello, friends, and welcome to the rest of the sermon. This is our chance, as we always do, to get deeper into the book of Matthew and recap the previous week's sermon. I've been missing you. I was out for a week, but we're back with us, and today with me once again, what you talking about, Kevin Willis?
Oh, yeah.
Hey, brother, how are you, man?
Good, doing well.
Well, good.
Doing well. You know, I've played a volleyball tournament and I don't know if many of you noticed Sunday, but I was like barely walking around.
Wait, you play volleyball?
I do, but I was super sore. I mean,
Yeah,
this old man hadn't played in a while.
Yeah, you kind of feel it, don't you?
Yeah, but it was good.
I tell you what, when I was out in Texas where I was staying, I had a chance to go for a walk. There's a nice little park, and it's like a 3-mile just loop around this park. And I did it. I was like, oh, that's really nice. And the next day I woke up and going, oh.
Yes.
You start to feel it a little bit more.
Yes.
It's amazing when you don't use those muscles. But so we're both a little sore, but getting better. We're here. What else is happening in the Willis household in your life, man?
Not a whole lot. Grant's home finally from college.
All
Gracie's
right.
got a couple more weeks left. And
so much for the empty nest,
kind of
huh?
Yeah.
Well,
We'll
good.
have them back for a few months this summer. But we probably won't see them. You know how
They
that is.
they just go. That's what the kids do. I was just talking to my boys about their schedule, and I'm like, yeah, you don't have much of a summer. It's going to be one thing after another. That's the way it is. So, hey, I'm glad that you were here. I'm a little nervous because I realized just before we started, I left my main notes downstairs in my office.
Yeah, well.
I hope I got a good memory. I've got
Oh,
a
you
few
do.
things. I don't know about
it'll be fine.
but I hope I can remember everything because we're going to go back over the sermon from Sunday. Actually, I should ask you, Pastor Kevin, was this past Sunday the greatest sermon you've ever heard?
Yeah, it was right up there with the best ever.
If you were here Sunday,
oh my goodness.
you notice that we started a new series inside of a series called The Greatest Sermon You Ever Heard, and it wasn't my sermon. Of course, we're talking about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and that is the greatest sermon. I'm giving some sermons about that sermon, and so this is kind of fun. Like we're in this whole series of Matthew, but we're in the smaller series for the Sermon on the Mount. We'll be in that for... I'm still kind of making my mind up. I think maybe we got 7 weeks, 6, 7, maybe 8 weeks to go through all. We could spend the whole year, I promise you, in the Sermon on the Mount. But we're going to just spend a few weeks in it. So it's really great. The greatest sermon you've ever heard. We get to talk about that. And we kind of got that started last Sunday. So I guess we should go ahead and do the sermon synopsis here in about 60 seconds, as we say. I don't know. I've never timed it, but I think it's about that time. So in case you missed it or just need a quick refresher of what we talked about this past Sunday when we started the greatest sermon you ever heard. Of course, we're right there in the beginning, the Beatitudes, and we talk about how this is the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, this repeated phrase of blessed are those. And we talked about how that word really means happiness, but not a happiness based on emotions and circumstances, a deeper happiness, and how we noticed how the things that make us happy, truly happy, are not what the world says. They being poor in spirit, being meek, mourning, being merciful, being peacemakers. So it points us to there is a happiness that is not found in earthly things, but a joy that is found in the Lord. It's pointing us to something deeper. And we've even looked at an example out of Acts 16, Paul and Silas in prison, beaten and persecuted, but there they were, rejoicing in the Lord. They were singing songs to him, and so others could hear. And so they were living out what Christ was talking about in the beginning part in his Sermon on the Mount. And so that was the sermon synopsis for today.
Wow, that was quick. That may have been even quicker than
I think it might have been
60
45 seconds. I don't know.
That was pretty good.
Very good. But that's what we talked about, and I hope you were there, or we'll go back and watch that. But, of course, this is the rest of the sermon.
Yes.
This is the part we didn't get to on Sunday morning, or maybe only just touched on, because there are several things, not only about these verses, the first 16 verses, but really the whole Sermon on the Mount that I think would be good to talk about. And in fact, the very first thing I want to talk about is, and we went over this in staff meeting. We all asked for opinions about this. It's been a few weeks back when we talked about it. But is this one sermon, or is this a collection of sayings and teachings of Jesus while he ministered in the area of Galilee? Right? That is a debate. If you're not aware of that, that is a debate that's out there. The Sermon on the Mount, was this one continuous teaching, or is this Matthew collecting the common teachings of Jesus in the area of Galilee? Because remember, if you listen to the last episode of the rest of the sermon, I told you we're in a section that doesn't really have a timestamp on it, right? After the Sermon on the Mount, we kind of go back to this happened, and this happened, and this happened, although we break from that every now and again. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is representative of Christ's ministry in Galilee. So, I mean, it tells us the end of chapter 4. This is, he was there in the area of Galilee, and they were all coming to him, and he was healing, and he was teaching. And so it kind of gives us this general statement, and then we get the Sermon on the Mount. And people sometimes think this is a collection, because if you go look in Mark, if you go look in Luke, you'll see some of the elements of the Sermon on the Mount. You'll see some of those familiar verses, but they're not grouped the same. Yeah. They're not said exactly the same. They come in different times. And so some people kind of had the interpretation that Matthew here is thinking about that, year and a half plus time, 2 years, Christ is really ministering in Galilee, and kind of said, all right, here's all the different teachings, and I'm going to compile them. Not everybody believes that, but some do. Now, do you want to know what I believe?
Yeah.
Of course you do. You said that with conviction, didn't you?
That's right. This is the greatest message ever.
This is the greatest rest of the sermon?
Yeah, greatest. Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I tend to fall in the camp of people who believe that this is one contiguous sermon. It's not segmented and compiled, that Christ did preach this from the beginning of what we have in chapter 5 through chapter 7 as one sermon.
Well, he does refer here, where he's seeing the crowds. He goes up on the mountain, that in that opening.
And that's some of the reasons why. In fact, at the very beginning of it and the very end of it, you have these markers that tell us there was an event. Right? First, you're right. He sees the crowd. Yeah. He goes up on the mountainside. So, I mean, it's not just saying, and Jesus taught these things. It tells that something happened that precipitated this teaching. And at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, you see how the crowd reacts. It says they were astonished how he taught with authority. And so there's a reaction or an event happening on both sides of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the reason I think we have these verses appear in Mark and Luke in slightly different orders or not in the same amount, but is because he obviously did teach the same things in his ministry. It's like this. You take an evangelist today who goes around to churches and preaches revivals or special events or speaks at camps, they're going to say a lot of the same thing. In fact, I kind of wish some days that's what they say the job of the evangelist is a lot easier. You just have 5 really good messages and just preach them over and over and over again. I got to come up with a different one every single Sunday.
You know what's kind of fun is you've been to where this was given.
Well, I've been to the traditional place
so
of
have
this. That's
I
right.
I was there.
There is a place, the Mount of the Beatitudes, where you can sit there and they think this is where. We don't know, but it sure gives that representation. Right. It sure gives that representation. Yeah. But Jesus would have taught on that hillside and probably others and many other places the things that he said. But I firmly believe that this is one ongoing teaching we have right there. Now, so, excuse me, we have, this teaching, this sermon, but the interpretation is, it's very interesting. There have been a lot of interpretations over the years. In fact, I have with me, it's a printout for one of my commentaries, the New American Commentary. If you like commentaries, the New American Commentary might set you back a few bucks, but it's a really good commentary provided by different authors throughout Scriptures. And it's one of the several ones that I go through and study. This was written by Dr. Craig Blomberg, a really good commentary on Matthew. And one of the things he was mentioning in this, I just was highlighting a few things, that there have been, there's a survey taken of different interpretations on the Sermon on the Mount, and they have been able to identify at least 36 unique interpretations of how to apply the Sermon on the Mount. It kind of shows you there's a wealth of information written about the Sermon on the Mount, but there's also been this variance on how to apply. And just for example, I'm not going to read all of this. But Dr. Blomberg kind of mentions about 8 of the common ones. There's been, since the medieval times, there's been kind of looking at just some ethical teaching. In fact, they even look at Sermon on the Mount as two levels of ethics, just kind of the general follower and the higher standard for clergy and things like this. I'm not sure that's a good interpretation, but that is one. There is Martin Luther. He had a very influential approach to the Sermon on the Mount, and I think there is some definite functionality to that this kind of serves as he puts the law for Paul, meaning it's kind of like the New Testament law, an understanding of how to apply it in our lives. It should basically, this high moral demand should drive us to our knees in repentance. And there is absolutely, we're going to see that. Wow, we're going to see that in the next couple of weeks, how what Christ teaches should drive us to our knees in repentance. The Anabaptists dealt with it. The Protestants kind of have dealt with this as a social gospel to some degree, not everybody. One of them, there have been the dispensationalists who have dealt with it. There have been the existentialists who have dealt with this. There's kind of like this idea of this just general thing that'll happen one day. There's a lot of approaches to the Sermon on the Mount. But I'm going to give us a pretty big theological word today. All right, we're going to learn some theological terminology.
All right.
That should be a segment on the show. Theological terminology. You don't seem impressed.
Yeah.
we need a
just
jingle.
make up a big word. Nobody will know.
Exactly. So, Dr. Ballenberg in his commentary says one of the good ways to understand the Sermon on the Mount is by applying inaugural eschatology. Inaugural eschatology. Now, what is inaugural eschatology? Well, eschatology is the study of end times. Okay, that's how all things will come to be and pass, and what Revelation talks about. Inaugurated eschatology is a view that says that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the events recorded to us in the gospel, inaugurated or began the end times. It was the first event that would lead to the end times. Right. Okay, that's inaugurated eschatology. That's a way of viewing how Christ's life was then and how it would be fully applied one day. In fact, what inaugurated eschatology gives us is something that's called the already not yet tension, meaning what Christ shows us and teaches us, there's a version of it that is already happening, but it hasn't fully happened. Not yet has it fully been brought about. Right. And that can really be understood when we think about the end times. He talks about the kingdom of heaven, even in this passage, and all the time. And we have an experience of what that is now, but we don't have it in its fullness yet. So there's an already not yet. That's inaugurated eschatology. Are you smarter today?
Wow. Yes. I'm going to try to work that in when I get home today.
Is that your word of the day?
Inaugurated eschatology.
That's
what
right.
do you want for dinner?
Inaugurated eschatology. I think we lost half our listeners just right now because they're going, oh, no. But actually, the reason I bring this up is not to get complicated seminary terminology. It's going to help us look at the first part of this, Beatitudes. If you get this idea of the already, not yet, we've received a part of it, but not yet, you can better understand the Beatitudes. Think of it like this. Let me just pick one of these. Blessed are those who mourn. This is verse 4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Did you hear the already, not yet? Blessed are they who mourn. So there's a blessed now, for they shall be comforted. Not yet. Let me pick even another examples. Verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Now, let me ask you a question. If I show you mercy in something, if I'm just feeling really good and godly and I want to be merciful to you, does that guarantee me that somewhere today I am going to be shown mercy, right? That's how it should balance out.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work that way, does it?
And a lot of times the people you show mercy to are not the ones that are going to return the favor most of the time. Not all the time, but
absolutely. And the same way in the peacemakers, right? You go, I'm going to go make peace with somebody, but it doesn't mean they're going to make peace with me.
Correct. Yeah.
And so here's this already not yet concept in play. I will be blessed and the happiness, that contentedness, that joyfulness in my life if I seek to be merciful and a peacemaker, and I'm willing to mourn over my own sins, but I won't receive it in its fullness, not yet. Not yet.
Right.
An already not yet concept. I will be shown mercy. By who? By God.
Yes.
I will have been given peace. By whom? By God. I will mourn, but I will be comforted. I still mourn in this life. You know when I won't mourn? Is when I'm in heaven before him.
Right.
So it's the already not yet thing happening here in the Beatitudes. It's a great way to understand that. In fact, let me show you something else. I didn't get to this on Sunday, but there's a secret here in the Beatitudes. It's really, really, really cool of this already not yet, this inaugurated eschatology. It's the word of the day for us to understand. Look at the first Beatitude. This is verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit. We talked about on Sunday, poor in spirit does not mean poor spiritual quality. It means that you recognize you're spiritually bankrupt without God. But look, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is, present tense, the kingdom of God. Okay, you with me? Kevin, are you with me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm making sure. All right, so is. That's the first part. Now look at the next several ones that come. Blessed are those who mourn, meek, all this stuff, for they shall.
Yeah.
They will. Okay? So the first one begins with, blessed is the poor in spirit, the one who recognize they're spiritually bankrupt without God, for theirs is. And then the rest of them say, blessed when you do these things, for you shall be. You will be. That's not yet. You won't receive it yet fully. But there's one more that's present tense.
There is.
There is. Which one is it?
The persecuted one.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The same phrase. And it's not saying shall be the kingdom of heaven, is the kingdom of heaven. And so I love this. The Beatitudes are kind of bookended with you have something now. Yes, these other ones talk about you'll receive a blessing from being one who is a peacemaker and who wants righteousness and purity and all the ones that are talked about. There's a blessedness that comes from this. And this is, I wish I could have talked about this Sunday because we got into this, the Beatitudes, the blessing you receive, the happiness you receive from this, living this kind of life. But in truth, you receive a portion of it now, like a foreshadowing of it now, of what you will receive. But you know what you do receive now is part of the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. And we talked about that in an earlier episode, which that in itself is this grand, mysterious, beyond comprehension. Yeah. We experience basically a relationship with him now. And think about how that makes sense. If I am poor in spirit, it means I don't have what it takes myself, so therefore I'm coming to God. So right now, I am a part of the kingdom of heaven. I'm a part of that. And think about also, if I'm persecuted, who was persecuted? Christ was persecuted. And people sometimes say they never feel closer to Christ than when they're persecuted for his name's sake. Yeah. I love how it brings out those two as present tense, now. And then the others are that will receive, that already, but not yet. I don't know, how do you see, Kevin, I'm going to put you on the spot right now. I've been talking for a while. Everybody's like, okay, Greg, be quiet. How do you see going about applying these Beatitudes, these blessings in your life? What are you taking away from this type of teaching of Christ right here?
Yeah, well, I think this is one of those topics that trip people up in their faith, especially when they become Christians at an early age. Because when you become a Christian at an early age, you haven't faced all these difficulties of life, the realities of life. And sometimes, if you're not grounded in this and understanding where your happiness, you can get sidetracked by the anger, by the challenges of life, by the so-called unfairness that we see that can be all around us. But we have to realize that if we're not careful, we focus in the here and now. And as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, our happiness is in the midst of this, but there's that thing that we look forward to, that longing to be perfect when we are before Christ, when Christ returns.
Absolutely. That's so important because, like I said, there's a lot of wrong ways to interpret
Yeah.
not only the whole Sermon on the Mount, but especially this Beatitudes, because there's some who are going to go to this and say, well, okay, I've just got a list of things that I've got to do right now.
Yeah.
In fact, you could have even misunderstood my sermon on Sunday to be like, okay, what I want you to do out there right now is just, if you'll just commit to be a person who just willing to be mourn over your sinfulness and seek purity and be a peacemaker. And I mean, all those things are good.
Yes.
Or like, here's what you've got to do. It's turning this into a social gospel kind of a thing.
Right.
And you realize, no, those things pour out of having come into God, poor in spirit,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then he shows you what it means to mourn and seek righteousness and want purity and all this. It comes out of that, but you realize the fullness is what comes later. And so having that understanding is absolutely right of what's going to come in its fullness, that already, but not yet.
Yes.
But we didn't end there, right? We talked about there's one more part of the introduction that oftentimes is dealt with separately. It's the passage that talks about the salt and the light. I used to have a T-shirt several years ago at a different church. I had a T-shirt business. I've told you this before, right?
Yeah.
I used to make these shirts. And so one time for our kids' ministry, the church I was pastoring, I made a shirt that had on the back of it, it had a salt shaker and a light bulb. And it just said, "Be these."
I've got one of those.
Do you have? I think I probably stole it from somebody else. Sorry, copyright infringement.
No, that's okay. But I like it. I've wore that a few times, and it brought up conversations.
I love it. Well, it's funny because after I made that shirt for our children's ministry, and a lot of people bought them and got them, I had some people going, "I don't get it," and I said, "Think about it, And then I show them the Bible verse. Oh, I get it. Be salt, be light. Yeah. Now, what is the connection between being the salt and the light passages to the Beatitudes? See, again, a lot of people separate this. I kind of touched on it Sunday. We talked about it maybe a little bit more depth in staff. What do you see the connection is in this, what Christ calls us to do?
Well, I see it as very action-oriented. There's something that people can see, observe. And he does say that, see your good works, that they may glorify the Father. So it's more than just a spoken word or you saying what you believe, but the Beatitudes are very much something that's observable in a life of a person when they're, the happiness or the joy of the Lord.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of like, again, the salt and the light. They're not meant to be, the salt has to be used.
Yes.
The light has to be applied. I think both of these are illustrations we can understand today, but were extremely powerful in Christ's day. Salt, they didn't have the refrigerator to go put their stuff in. What do? What do they preserve with? Salt. In fact, they lived near the salt bank of the world, the Dead Sea. I mean, they had salt was all over there.
It's one of the things I was reading, how interesting it is, but salt is not good unless you match it up with the meat or the thing that you're trying to preserve.
Right, yeah.
And so, as believers, this is not a command for us to be separate totally, but we are to be integrated with the world, with the people that need to know Jesus. And when we do that, when our saltiness comes in contact with them, then we're able to even shine that much more, be more powerful,
right?
Or the words that we say, the actions that we give.
And that's the whole point behind what's going on here. It's like salt, it's supposed to be used, and if it's not used, what good is it? Or if it's mixed with other things, what good is it? The same way as light. They didn't have the artificial light we have today. That one little light on a hill could shine for so far. Why would you have a light and hide it under a bushel? And the point of it is going back to these Beatitudes, there are some who feel like, okay, as a believer, I've really got to separate myself from the world. Like, hey, if I'm going to pursue purity and righteousness and meekness and all this stuff, that I've got to be kind of pulled away. That's only because we know the moment we get in the world, that those things are under assault. That's a terrible assault.
Oh my goodness.
Unintentional pun. But those things are under attack. How about that? We go in the world and we don't feel like being meek. We go in the world and we struggle with being peacemakers. And so there's this feeling like we got to pull away. In fact, go look at church history. There have been those who want this monastic lifestyle, kind of like, okay, we have to pursue this way of what Christ is talking to us about is we got to pull away from the world completely.
That was when I was in seminary and church history, these guys that would, back whenever it was, they would get up on poles and live their life on top of a pole. You remember that?
Right now, that sounds really good.
Well,
I don't know.
But it's like they're like a statue up on a pole to separate themselves so much so God would, to bring favor with God,
There have been plenty of people over the ages who have done things like this, who have separated themselves. And Christ, right now, again, he's dealing with disciples, not only disciples that day, but all disciples, all are coming after him. Like, no, you're not supposed to be separate. Like, your joy that you're going to receive from following after me, following this completely counter-cultural lifestyle, this joy that you're going to receive is going to be so good. Why would you keep it to yourself? It's going to be just like salt is not only the preserver, it's the flavor enhancer. I mean, you're going to enhance the flavor of the life around you because people are going to see those good works. Not the good works you do to make God happy, but it's because you are happy in God. They're going to see all this out of your life. Why in the world would you hide it? Why would you keep it to yourself? And I think this, I almost look at it as a warning a little bit that he's giving his disciples. We're about to go out into a world that's going to be coming after you, that's going to try to steal that joy and happiness, but I'm wanting you to shine forth. And that's why I talked about Paul and Silas over in Acts 16, how, man, they were being beaten, but they couldn't help but singing, I've got joy, joy, joy down in my heart. I don't think that song was out then. But
probably not.
Yeah, probably not. But they were singing to the Lord and praying, and everybody's hearing, and they're in the jail cell going, what's with these weirdos, right? They've got something going on in their life that we don't have that should be seen by others. And I think I love connecting the salt and light passage to the Beatitudes as it reminds us that as we pursue to live a life of blessing, that it cannot be lived to self or privately. And that's just so easy to do sometimes. We talk about our quiet times with God. And, even in church, sometimes we kind of separate ourselves from the world. We're glad to be in our building and where we feel safe and comfortable. We forget, no, we're supposed to be in the world. Like, we may come worship together, but our life is supposed to be lived publicly. Our faith is supposed to be lived openly.
One of the not funny, but interesting things about his wording here when he describes putting a bushel or a basket over the light, he doesn't say snuff the light out. So with a basket, it's still lit, but you don't get to see the benefit of the light because it's covered.
And that's true, and that's why it's a powerful illustration. How many people are living a life of faith, but nobody can see it?
Right.
Nobody can see it. The light is there. They're genuine believers, but for whatever reason, fear, busyness, whatever it might be, nobody sees them. It's kind of like the whole thing. I shouldn't have to tell anybody I'm a Christian. They should know it by how I live my life. They should see my actions. And this is what Christ is getting to. Now, I want to talk about one last thing before we kind of wrap it up today. Because there might be for some a passage like this, but all the Beatitudes as being a peacemaker and purity and righteousness, and then being salt and being light, and people are kind of feeling bad about themselves, if we're honest, right? Because first of all, every one of us look at times in our life where we haven't lived up to the standard. In fact, somebody listening to my sermon on Sunday or listening to this podcast might go, well, I don't want to admit it, but what the Sermon on the Mount really makes me do is makes me feel bad because I have a light, but I'm just really not good at letting it shine. I may be salt, but I'm not enhancing anybody else's life. I'm struggling with being a peacemaker. I really am bad at showing mercy. It's like kind of like it's putting a standard out here that's really hard to meet. And Christ is doing that on purpose. In fact, I don't want to spoil what's ahead because the next couple of weeks is really going to drive this home. Christ is intentionally starting to raise the bar, the standard, the expectation, and it should feel difficult to me. In fact, again, I'm just really hesitant to get ahead of myself here, but pretty soon we're looking at where Christ says, be perfect. As your heavenly Father is perfect, you be perfect. And Excuse me, what? Right? And in fact, this coming Sunday, we're going to talk. I mentioned this is the thesis statement of Matthew in Matthew 5:17-20. We're going to really jump into the whole point of the sermon. And in a way, I know this sounds odd, but it's supposed to make us feel bad.
Yeah.
We're supposed to get confronted with our lack of perfection. As I read the Beatitudes, I go, yes, this is what should make me happy. But then I go, man, I really stink sometimes at living out the Beatitudes and being the salt and being the light. Okay, you're supposed to feel that way. And there's a reason why. In fact, I hinted at it. I'm not going to say any more. Maybe people figure it out. But there's a reason why Jesus is bringing this up, why he's raising the bar. You think he's raising the bar now? Wait until we talk about these next few verses this coming Sunday and in next week's episode. I mean, Christ is going to raise the standard so high for us that, I mean, at some point, people are going to feel like, well, I guess it's hopeless for me. Well, it's not. It's not hopeless. But Christ is doing something. This is the introduction of the sermon. Remember we talked about that. These first few verses, the introduction. Next week we get the thesis. Then we get what's called the antithesis, where he does the "you have heard it said, but I say to you." And then we kind of develop this theme. We develop it out over several weeks in the Sermon on the Mount. But if you're feeling bad, if you're feeling like you're not that great of a Christian, I'm not talking just to you, Pastor Kevin. I'm talking to all our listeners here. Don't worry. There's hope. You're supposed to be confronted with your imperfection.
Part of the purpose.
Absolutely.
Part of the purpose he's trying to get at.
And so that's just kind of, I hope that getting people in, their foot in the door on this greatest sermon they've ever heard. There's more to come, but I hope that's kind of helping them understand the beginning of this. And if they are kind of feeling bad, well, don't give up. Don't give up, because there's hope coming. Christ is going to show us something that is so wonderful, and we're going to really see this in a beautiful way in the coming weeks. So be ready for that as we continue through the greatest sermon you've ever heard. Not Pastor Greg, but from Jesus Christ our Savior. Yes. So it's been a great day. Thanks for joining me. We've learned about inaugurated eschatology.
Awesome.
We've got everybody who listens to this must use that word from now on. And I don't know what else we've learned about. We talked about a lot of stuff, but we are blessed.
Yes.
Blessed are we, for we have today been a part of the rest of the sermon.
Sermon.
Rest of the story. You messed it up. All right. Thanks, Pastor Kevin, for joining us.
It was a good day.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us for the rest of the sermon.